Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. As you are entering, please go ahead and look at the bottom of your screen and select an interpretation channel from the menu below. You have a choice of English or Portuguese today. And please select whichever channel will work best for you to listen to our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining. Just going to give a few more minutes as more people are joining us. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar for World Fair Trade Day today. If you want to just put in the chat where you are joining us from, we'd love to hear from folks. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you haven't already, if you want to go down to the menu at the bottom of your Zoom screen and choose your language for interpretation from the little globe menu. You have a choice of English or Portuguese if you want to select which language you will be joining us with. Which language will work best for you to listen with. That would be fantastic. Thank you. I'm so happy to see so many people here today for World Fair Trade Day. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. And Katie, on the backside, if you want to spotlight just the folks who have their cameras on, that would be fantastic. So then we can have the nice little Brady bunch of squares that you get. And we'll be getting started in just a few minutes. If you're just joining us, and you can go down to the menu at the bottom of the screen, select English or Portuguese from the interpretation menu. That's the little globe kind of on the bottom bar over towards the right-hand side. That would be fantastic.
Are you able to see just the folks pinned now, Anna?
I am a panelist, so my view will be different, but there is an attendee option that you can see.
Okay, let's see. Because right now I see just, let's see. That should do it.
Great, thanks so much. And
yeah, no problem.
Everybody who's joining us today. I think we'll get started here in just a few minutes. And if you want to select your interpretation option from the menu, thanks to everybody who's been here since exactly 9 a.m. and heard me say that many times over. But yeah, today's conversation is being recorded and also streamed live on Facebook. The conversation today is available in English and in Portuguese if you want to choose that from the menu down at the bottom of Zoom. And we have some amazing panelists joining us today. We'll be talking together for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. If you want to put your questions in the Q&A box, that's another option down on that bottom Zoom menu. Says Q&A with some little chat bubbles. Put it in there if you want to, or in Zoom if you're listening, or I'm sorry, if you're listening on Facebook, you can put it in the comments over on Facebook. Feel free to have a discussion in the chat as you go. Yeah, and big thanks to my colleague Katie, who is helping on the backside, the tech and the Q&A work. And thank you to our interpreters today who are helping bring more people into the conversation. So yeah, I'm Anna Canning. I'm the campaigns manager for Fair World Project. And Saturday is World Fair Trade Day, which is a day when people around the globe lift up the movement for fair trade. And, here in the US, I think that fair trade has often gotten distilled down to being a consumer product, like a label on a bag of coffee or a chocolate bar. But today we're going to be talking much bigger than a bar, and we're going to be hearing from some amazing leaders who are working on solidarity to really build a movement for just trade. So I'm really glad to have all of you joining us today in that conversation. And, to ground us in this conversation about fair trade, I want to talk for a minute about its opposite, which is unfair trade, or, what it regularly gets called, which is free trade. And coffee and chocolate are, these classically recognizable fair trade products for a good reason. That they're both crops that have been really shaped by colonialism and a system of trade that is based on extracting as much as possible from people and communities around the globe, and then using that land and labor to enrich just a handful of people in Europe and the US mostly. And I was thinking about that, a few years ago, I was in Brussels and I was standing in the middle of this central square surrounded by all these buildings that literally have gold facades. And then there's all of these little, chocolate shops around selling what they call Belgian chocolate. And, looking around, I was like, here it is, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo was a Belgian colony. Here is all the wealth of the Congo surrounding me in this little square in Brussels. And, so our system of trade is really based on that extractive system that takes wealth from communities around the world and then redistributes it to a few in Europe and the US. And of course, Canada and the UK also. And, since that time, rules have really been written to help codify that system and hold it in place. And one of those bodies where those rules are written and negotiated is the World Trade Organization. And I think some of our panelists today are going to be talking about, those rules and how those decisions play out on the international level. And so, spoiler alert for the rest of the webinar, but, those rules of free trade are really far from fair. That free trade is about freedom for just a select few. And it's freedom for goods and money to move across borders. It's freedom for, corporations to move around the globe in search of places where they can pay people the least and make the most profit. But, for the overwhelming majority of people in the world, that freedom doesn't really exist in the same way in trade. Instead, it looks more like a global race to the bottom that writes off, so many people as disposable in the name of power and money for just a few people. So, that brings me all the way back to that example of the Congo, right? And the wealth of the Congo getting taken to enrich Belgium is really relevant to the way that trade plays out today. That wealth is getting extracted from primarily Black and brown communities and hoarded by corporations and the mostly white ultra rich. And so trade justice is a matter of racial justice. And it's also a matter of climate justice, that this same system of trade is what got us into the climate crisis that we are living through today. And the same response to in the response to the climate crisis, we see the same dynamics playing out again, casting too many people and communities as disposable. But the good news, today we're going to be hearing from people who have been pushing back on that narrative and from movements around the globe who have been advocating for trade, global health, and food systems that put people first. So without further ado, I'm really happy to give to each of those panelists to introduce themselves. Can you just tell us your name, organization, and what connects you to the topics we're talking about today? Fabio, do you want to kick us off?
Pode ser. Para mim, boa tarde, né? Eu estou às 13 horas aqui do Brasil, estou falando de Sergipe, um dos menores estados, o menor estado do Brasil, na verdade. Eu sou engenheiro florestal, sou militante do Movimento Sem Terra, que é um movimento que cumpre um papel há mais de 35 anos de combater o agronegócio, e de construir um projeto popular para o país, né, com base numa reforma agrária que contemple as diversas dimensões da, da vida das pessoas, né? Não é só ter acesso à terra, é ter acesso à terra, é ter dignidade para conseguir produzir o seu alimento de forma saudável, é, apresentar uma outra forma de relação com a natureza, né? Então, a nossa relação com a natureza, ela se baseia nos princípios da agroecologia, é ter acesso à educação, ter acesso ao lazer e poder oferecer à cidade um alimento que tenha um apelo social, porque a gente enfrenta um agronegócio onde 1% da população brasileira controla 46% das terras, em detrimento de milhares que não têm acesso à terra. A gente produz um alimento que tem uma relação com o meio ambiente diferenciada, né, na perspectiva da coevolução, enfim. E traz também uma questão histórica, que é a dívida que a gente tem com o povo africano que foi escravizado e com o povo, com nossa população tradicional indígena que foi assassinada. Então, o nosso trabalho ele se sustenta nessas dimensões. Então, é um prazer estar aqui. Aproveito para dividir e enviar um forte abraço desse canto do país.
Thank you, Fabio. Sonia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm also so glad to be here. I'm stepping in for Fabiola, our wonderful lead organizer at the Food Chain Workers Alliance, who couldn't be here. So apologies for that. But we are both connected with the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a coalition of food worker organizations spanning the entire food chain. And these are all worker-based organizations that are working to improve wages and working conditions for workers all through the food chain. Fair World Project is one of our members, and we have 34 members that represent workers in both the US and Canada. And for us, we connect into this theme because we see that fair trade is integrally connected to the vision of the food system that we are trying to build towards. So a vision where food workers, their work is valued, where their work is respected, and where they can share the wealth of their labor. And the principles of fair trade that we'll be hearing about through the webinar, are one tool to get there, to get to that kind of food system where there's democratic control by communities, and critical for us, where workers have the right to organize. I think we're going to be talking about all the ways that our current system does not promote those values, but that we see we're organizing together, building global solidarity, we can be building that kind of economic and food system that does put workers, communities at the center. And I'm very glad to be here to kind of hear all the different threads of how we're trying to do that collectively.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sonia. Manpreet, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I just want to start off by thanking Fair World Project for bringing us all together. It's amazing to be able to have so many individuals with such brilliant work come together and talk about food justice and food sovereignty. I also would like to start off by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. As a member of the fair trade community, I'm the founder of Art of Citizenry, which is a consulting and educational platform dedicated to challenging systemic oppression within the social impact space. For me, I identify as Punjabi Sikh. I'm Seattle based, and I feel that those identities really intersect with the work I do as a community organizer. The reason I'm so passionate about being here today is I think that so much of how we approach fair trade and how we approach equity and justice within the global fair trade community is intertwined with how we think about individuals in all aspects of society and how we come together. So a lot of my work over the past 2 years has been around community organizing related to the farmers' protest in India. Part of that involved working in collaboration with Fair World Project on creating a solidarity statement and organizing fair trade organizations and businesses to sign on to the statement. Another part of my work really falls into the educational spectrum. So I have a podcast called Art of Citizenry, and I also sit on the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of the Fair Trade Federation. To me, it's really important that we recognize that our liberation as communities and struggles against a colonialist system are all interconnected, which is why I'm really excited for today's conversation. So thank you, Anna, for hosting us.
Thank you for being here. And Will, do you want to present yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone for being here. And thank you to the Fair World Project for inviting me. My name is Jamil Wiltschko. I'm the director of the California Trade Justice Coalition. We're a coalition of labor unions, environmental groups, and human rights organizations, mostly in California, who are focused on fighting for people-driven rather than corporate-driven trade deals. And I think, Anna, you really did a great job of highlighting the fact that trade impacts so many different issue areas. It intersects so many issues as well, from racial justice to the climate change movement to workers' rights to regular people versus the 1%. And for us, it's been a really personal fight, because a lot of our members have been displaced by trade deals. They've been they've seen their wages driven down. They've seen themselves forced into this race to the bottom when it comes to working standards and wages. I think that it's really wonderful that all these folks came out here today to talk about this and to highlight the importance of what we have to fight for, because the fight is definitely not over. It won't be over for a long time. And we really need to make sure that we're continuing to push forward in this movement. So thank you all, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, everybody. And so I'm going to have a round of questions for our panelists, and a reminder for everybody listening if you need interpretation, please go down to the bottom menu, select there's a menu down there, a little globe to choose English or Portuguese. If you are on mobile, there will be just 3 little dots there instead of a globe. And if you have any questions as our panelists are talking, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we do have time built in to get to those. To start off, Manpreet, you mentioned the Indian farmers' protest, which I think was the biggest protest movement on the globe. Can you talk a little bit about that protest and what their demands were and why they're so important to the topic of fair trade?
Absolutely. Yeah, so India's farmers and farm workers led the largest protest movement in history to fight for economic, social, and food justice. To just provide more context around where it all started. So in September 2020, the Indian government unilaterally passed 3 new agricultural bills that deregulated and privatized India's agricultural industry and dismantled the minimum support price, or what we often refer to as the MSP, for crops. It also removed restrictions on the purchase of land by corporations and removed limits on stockpiling commodities. So essentially what we saw was corporations were able to, under these bills, come in, hoard, and really regulate the market. And one of the things I think that people still really struggle to realize is that these bills were not just threatening the livelihoods of farmers and farm workers, but they were also threatening the livelihoods of people, average people. And that's the thing that I really want us to recognize, because so often we have this disconnect between our food, within our food systems, and that disconnect results in a lot of harm because we don't realize how these struggles are so interconnected. You know, agriculture is the primary source of income for over half of India's population, 81% of whom are farming on 2 acres or less. So with no safety net, essentially, which was what these bills was going to result in, small farmers are vulnerable to being undercut by large corporations. We see this happening in the US, right? Like, none of this is foreign to us. These are things that are happening globally within food systems. And ultimately, when small farmers are not able to compete against these large corporations, they're not able to sustain themselves and their communities. And the reality is that so much of this, you know, we could go into the history, and there's so much of this that's tied to the movement of Green Revolution in India. But the thing that I think is just so important to recognize is that there was such a focus on the concept of MSP, or the minimum support price, which still is in flux in many ways. But the thing that we have to realize is that technically MSP in India is supposed to be assured for 23 crops, but in practice, it's actually only provided for wheat and paddy. And that also is the particular variants of wheat and paddy that are, you know, essentially part of what we are seeing, the aftermath of the Green Revolution and the ways that it's impacted farmers and farm workers across India. You know, so in 2019, there was a report that in that year, over 10,000 farmers died by suicide in India. And I think that that number, the exact number, is grossly understated. But it's important to recognize that this fight was really about livelihoods. It really came down to recognizing that for way too long, global food systems have been moving towards being not community driven, and instead driven by corporations. And in light of the World Fair Trade Day, and all of us here, our work, you know, in some ways our work intersects with the notion and movement of fair trade. I think it's really important that we reflect on what fair trade means as a concept. But before we do that, I think it's important to recognize that, 90% of India's farmers can't cover the basic costs of fertilizer, seeds, pesticides, and other equipment, right? And when we talk about creating fair systems, we have to recognize that there are systemic reasons why systems are broken. It goes deep into the way that we are thinking about the role of individuals within our economies. And trade is a huge part of that. And at the core, when we think about fair trade, we're thinking about building economies in which we prioritize people over corporations. So when I think about the farmers' protest, it was exactly the type of movement that I wish, and I'm glad to see that many fair trade organizations did speak up in solidarity with, because if we are talking about prioritizing people over corporations, those bills were doing exactly the opposite. They were prioritizing corporations over people. And, you know, during the farmers' protest, we saw so many violations of human rights take place. We saw independent journalists being silenced and imprisoned on false pretenses. We saw so many people disappear at the hands of police brutality. Over 700 people died during the protest, and this protest lasted for over a year. And all of this happened at the hands of an authoritative government, which again comes back to, if as a movement we believe that we have to prioritize people and that people have the rights and autonomy to voice their opinions, then that's exactly what this protest was about. And that's why it intersects with fair trade. Sorry, long answer.
I love it. And Manpreet, I feel like whenever you and I start talking, it ends up with the long answer. But thank you. And I think these things are also connected. Will, I know you've been organizing for trade justice for a long time, and most recently, your organization has been focusing a lot on global vaccine access. Can you talk a bit about why that's a trade issue?
Yeah, so it's kind of like what you were talking about at the introduction. You know, free trade isn't really free. It comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to working people, the environment, and human rights across the globe. And so all too often, we've seen that these trade policies are driven by corporations, and they kind of impact everything from vaccine access to, you know, trying to fight against climate change. And so, you know, one of the trade agreements that my organization initially was kind of formed to oppose was Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in the 90s. So I was 3 when that happened, but my predecessors before me were fighting that fight. And, you know, one of the things that Nafta put into place that a lot of other trade agreements followed was something called the Investor State Dispute Settlement System. And so what that is it's a system for corporations. It's basically these corporate courts that are set up so that whenever a country, you know, creates a law or anything that is seen as a barrier, the corporation can sue, could bring it up into the Investor State Dispute Settlement System because that country infringed on their right to profit. So what does it look like in terms of the environment? So there's this Keystone XL Pipeline. I think you've all probably heard of it. A lot of people have fought against it. You know, during the Obama administration, there was a huge movement led by indigenous activists in the United States to oppose this thing. And so the Obama administration said they weren't going to go through with it. But the company behind it, TransCanada, was able to use their special investor rights that were locked in by NAFTA to sue the US for $15 billion. And that's for expected loss of future profits. And so Trump administration comes in, they decide to, you know, go through with the pipeline. And so lawsuit vanishes. Biden administration comes in, they decide to not go through with the pipeline, lawsuit reemerges. And so that's where we are. These corporations can hold countries and people hostage. And so, you know, you'd think that in things like a global pandemic that wouldn't happen, but it's been happening since the beginning, where you have these pharmaceutical monopolies who have made these vaccines with a lot of US taxpayer money, especially Moderna, that they're essentially going to countries individually and saying, what can you give us in exchange for vaccines? Because, you know, they have the intellectual property locked in. They can't, you can't produce generic versions without some kind of waiver. And so that waiver is called the TRIPS waiver. And that was proposed to the WTO by India, South Africa, and 100 other nations in October 2020. But what's been happening is, since we still don't have that waiver, the these companies will go to countries and say, hey, like put up your military bases as collateral, like agree to never have any lawsuits over like anything, or like let us have this, let us have that, and they're gouging these countries individually, which means millions and millions of people don't get access to vaccines, and tons of people die. And so we've seen this disparity in the global south, right? We've seen that a lot of countries in the global south do not have access to vaccines. And so what that means is you get more variants, and more variants equals, endless pandemic. It means more booster shots, or it means new vaccines, which are being developed right now, that'll be introduced and then, given to countries like the US and other places, but not given to, countries in the global south. And so, this TRIPS waiver campaign has been what we've been focused on right now, to push to get this through at the WTO. And so, really realistically, the way to get it through is to get the United States to push for it. And so what that looks like is, since October 2020, we've been organizing around this. And so what we did in the first part of 2021, and even back in October, was we worked to get Congress members throughout the United States to come out in support of the TRIPS waiver, which is something that, there's a lot of pharma lobbying money out there. I know pharma spent $100 million in the first 3 months opposing this in 2021, $100 million they spent on lobbyists. And what we did was we built grassroots power throughout the country. We had folks organized and meeting with members of Congress, protesting outside members of Congress offices. And what it led to is a letter that was signed by the majority of House Democrats in Congress. And so as soon as that letter came out, which was, I think, May of 2021, I think the day after, President Biden came out in support of the TRIPS waiver. And that was a huge thing that changed, that was unprecedented. No president had done anything like that before. And so that's a big deal, right? But the problem is a lot of countries were still opposing the TRIPS waiver, and the WTO is a consensus organization. And so, you have to get those other countries in line. And the US can push for things, but there also has to be outside pressure as well. And so, all over the world, activists were pressuring their governments to come out in support of the TRIPS waiver. And, over the summer, we personally were doing a lot of actions outside consulates in California, because a lot of countries have consulates in California. And, we did actions, we held signs, we did media events, all kinds of things. And, one by one, those countries started coming out in support of the TRIPS waiver. But the countries that did not were, Germany is one of the biggest countries that's been opposing this, and they're still opposing it. They have a huge pharmaceutical industry in Germany. And so, the Biden administration, for what it's worth, said they support it, but they haven't been doing a lot to push for it, because if they wanted, they could force a TRIPS waiver overnight. And so, what's been happening lately in this fight is a bad proposal was leaked. There was a proposal kind of with all the worst elements from the EU and Germany in it. And it would, do a lot of things. It essentially doesn't solve anything. And so, the Director General of the WTO came to the US and tried to push for it. Didn't get a ton of support here, mostly met with corporate lobbyists at those fancy dinner parties. And then, it's been introduced now formally, but a lot of countries are still not supporting it. And so what we really need to do in the United States right now is continue to pressure the Biden administration to A, not go through with this bad version, and then B, push for the good version. And so that's what we've been working on. And it's obviously, it's something that you wouldn't think necessarily is connected to trade, but you realize trade is connected to everything. And this isn't like an issue that is super hard to grasp, because it's lives that are at stake. It's human lives. Every day, I think, some of the signs we had were like 10,000 deaths a day, and then I had to adjust them to 12,000 deaths a day. It's something that, anyone should get on board with. And it just shows how broken a lot of these free trade systems are, that it puts profits over human lives. So yeah.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I mean, it was amazing for me as somebody who came out of food to understand and look at the ways that all of the rules around trade are really written to protect, like it's written into patent law kind of language around protecting those profits and holding those onto those life-saving medicines for people.
Yeah, it's really horrible. And the lobbyists are, they don't have good arguments ever. They just have money. That's kind of how they do it.
Yep. Yeah. And, for folks on this call who are connected more to food movements, I think it's interesting to see too, that some of these laws around patents are the same thing that are being used around seeds around the world. Is another way in which, all of these trade struggles and the dots get connected. But Sonia, do you want to talk a little bit, shifting to that food segue, that your organization, Food Chain Workers Alliance, organizes with workers across borders. Can you talk some about how global trade impacts workers in the food system?
Yeah, well, I think just layering on from your intro, Anna, and from what everyone has been saying, that it's the theme that's so clear, that global trade is built around opportunities for corporations to exploit both communities as well as workers and make a profit. And who is that at the expense of? It's workers, communities, and the environment, and more broadly our world. And so we see this connection directly with the work that we do, because we see how these kinds of trade policies are driving landlessness, are driving economic conditions that force communities, force workers to migrate, and that when they do migrate, what are the kinds of jobs that are open to workers? It's often in the most exploited sectors of our economy, and it's no coincidence that the majority of those jobs are in the food system. The food system, is probably a lot of folks who are on the call who are connected to these themes know, is it is the largest source of employment in our economy, and it at the same time pays some of the lowest hourly wages to frontline workers when you compare work in other industries. And when we gather with worker leaders and talk about the issues that food chain workers are facing, we see so many commonalities, and workers directly make those connections, that these jobs are dominated by workers of color. They're often the most dangerous, whether we're talking about farm work, warehouse jobs, restaurant jobs, and there's a very low incidence of unionization. And we know that the kinds of larger systemic threads that we're talking about help to create those conditions. Anna, you said at the beginning, corporations and products are able to cross borders, but workers' mobility is heavily restricted, and it's restricted in a way that helps to generate that exploitation. So whether it's the kinds of conditions that when people are forced to migrate and there aren't pathways to come in safe ways that grant citizenship or permanent residency on arrival, workers are put in circumstances where they're working in ways that it's much harder to organize to take on conditions that are unsafe or just are unfair. And when we look at programs like guest worker programs, which our members in Canada have been organizing for many years with Canada's guest worker program, and increasingly farm worker members in the US are also seeing that this program is expanding, the H2A program, and that these are both examples of ways that the mobility of workers is restricted so that they are working in exploitative labor conditions, where they're tied to one employer, where there are so many barriers to speaking out. And so for us at the Food Chain Workers Alliance, looking at the roots of why the food system has such low wages and dangerous jobs, we have to look at and make those connections and look at that history of colonialism, the history that drives the way that agriculture, the history of slavery in the US, but also in the Caribbean, in the global South, more broadly, all of these sort of threads of imperialism and colonialism, how they lead us to where we are today, and why our solidarity is so critical across borders. Making those connections and looking at what are the ways that we can support the right to organize and food worker organizing to help transform these systems. And one of the ways that, the things that are so inspiring to be working in this space is to see that our struggles have so much in common as well, that the way that people experience the impacts of these trade policies and the kinds of activities that corporations are able to perpetuate in their communities inform struggle in Guatemala, that then when someone migrates, they bring that analysis, they bring that experience to their fights here in the US or in Canada. And I was just thinking of an example in a recent leadership training that we led with some member groups of extremely powerful farm worker leader who talked about just that how she first got involved in a struggle, taking on a multinational corporation, trying to mine in her community in Guatemala. And they were successful in that fight of stopping the kind of extraction that would happen. But we know that there's so many other of those fights that are not successful, and that she brought that experience with her and is using that experience to inform how she fights for fairness for farm workers in New York State. And so I think that's what we see as the antidote, in a way that our solidarity can be global, and the way that we make these connections across borders and across sectors of the food chain and across our communities is sort of the path forward to help us transform the system and the kind of impact that these policies have.
Thank you, Sonia. That's so powerful. And, I think we've seen that so much this year. We've been working some in support of farm workers in New York State who have been trying to organize and, against or in the supply chain of the yogurt company Chobani, and that they've brought so much of that experience and knowledge from struggles around the world. And actually just this week, seeing so many connections between what they're seeing in New York and then melon workers in Honduras facing so many of similar struggles, and actually through the Food Chain Workers Alliance being able to connect some of those dots and that narrative again and again. And I think that solidarity is so powerful. And so shifting to that theme of solidarity and working across continents and borders. Fabio, can you talk some about your work for food sovereignty and just what food sovereignty means and how global solidarity is part of that work that you do?
Então, antes de entrar nesse tema, eu queria dialogar com o Jamil. Ele traz uma fala muito provocativa do ponto de vista da indústria farmacêutica, e como a gente está falando de alimento, eu queria só lembrar uma coisa aqui e dividir a minha resposta em 2, 3 tópicos. Primeiro, chamar atenção para a Bayer. A Bayer produz semente transgênica, produz herbicida, produz fertilizante, e produz aspirina, o remédio para dor de cabeça. Para ela fechar o ciclo, ela só falta vender caixão, né? Ou alugar espaço em cemitério, porque, enfim, ela tanto controla o mercado de semente transgênica como toda a cadeia produtiva, e inclusive entra no ramo da medicina. Então, é uma transnacional que causa o mesmo impacto aqui em Sergipe, que causa na Índia, que causa nos Estados Unidos, que causa na Alemanha, que causa nos países africanos. Então, se ela age da mesma forma articulada no mundo inteiro, é necessário espaços como esse para a gente também construir uma resistência no mundo inteiro, uma resistência que seja baseada na troca de experiência, mas também que seja baseada no enfrentamento a essas multinacionais. Então, essa é a primeira questão que eu queria abordar. A segunda é, a gente precisa discutir a nossa matriz produtiva. Não dá para produzir alimentos da mesma forma que a gente vinha produzindo ao longo dos últimos 30, 40 anos. A gente precisa assumir uma opção política pela agroecologia, por uma agricultura que produz alimento saudável, ao mesmo tempo que respeite o trabalho das mulheres, o trabalho dos jovens, e uma relação diferenciada com a natureza, né? A gente precisa de menos veneno jogado no solo, a gente precisa de menos veneno jogado nas águas, a gente precisa de menos veneno empurrado sobre a nossa comida e os nossos medicamentos. Para vocês terem uma ideia, cada brasileiro consome por ano 9.000 litros de veneno. Essa é uma pesquisa de um órgão muito respeitado aqui no Brasil, que chega a essa conclusão. Cada brasileiro consome, em média, diluído nos seus alimentos, mais de 9 litros de veneno. Né? Um veneno que é usado no tomate, é usado na batata, é usado no pimentão, enfim. Com relação a essa discussão do comércio, eu queria destacar o seguinte: o Brasil é um dos maiores exportadores de produtos agrícolas do mundo, mas não produz comida para o povo brasileiro. O Brasil produz soja, produz algodão, produz milho, produz carne para abastecer outros mercados, enquanto o povo brasileiro está passando fome. A gente voltou para o mapa da fome no Brasil. Então, já são mais de 19 milhões de pessoas passando fome aqui no país. Ou seja, a agricultura tem um papel importante no PIB nacional, porém, ela não dialoga, ela não responde à necessidade do nosso povo. Então, a gente precisa lutar por uma reforma agrária que dê condições de vida para as pessoas, e eu vou repetir, não é só terra que a gente quer ter terra, a gente quer escola, a gente quer saúde, a gente quer lazer. Então, não é só terra que a gente precisa rever o nosso modelo de produção de alimento. Então, precisa ser um alimento produzido respeitando a questão ambiental, mas, sobretudo, respeitando a saúde das pessoas. A gente bateu recorde na liberação de venenos no mundo, nunca se aprovou tanto agrotóxico como se aprovou no Brasil nos últimos 2 anos do governo Bolsonaro. Nunca se desmatou tanto no Brasil como se desmatou nesses últimos anos. E a gente está falando de um bioma, de uma região do país que é ocupada pelos indígenas, pela nossa população tradicional. Então, nunca se matou, talvez na história recente, tirando a época da colonização portuguesa, tanto índio como tem se matado nos últimos anos. Então, a provocação que eu faço aqui para responder essa pergunta é rever a nossa estrutura agrária, rever a nossa forma de produção de alimentos e rever o destino desse alimento. Esse alimento precisa corresponder a uma demanda interna de uma população que cada vez mais passa fome, em detrimento do aumento do PIB e do enriquecimento de poucas pessoas. Então, essas são algumas das coisas. Ainda para dialogar com essa questão da solidariedade global, eu queria reforçar que espaços como esses, eles precisam ser incentivados do ponto de vista onde os camponeses possam se encontrar, possam trocar experiências sobre como produzir em respeito com a natureza e de forma saudável, e, sobretudo, como resistir ao avanço do agronegócio. né? Então, a gente do Movimento Sem Terra, eu não poderia deixar de falar nisso, a gente tem brigadas, a gente tem grupos de camponeses na Zâmbia, no Haiti, em Cuba, na China, na Venezuela, onde a gente se propõe a aprender, a levar um pouco do que a gente conhece na nossa prática diária, mas, sobretudo, de se aproximar a esses camponeses do mundo inteiro na perspectiva de resistir e dar passos adiante, né? E dar passos para frente na perspectiva de combater esse modelo devastador que é o capital, a forma como o capital trabalha no campo.
Thanks so much, Fabio, and thank you so much for connecting the dots, right, between the pharmaceutical company Bayer and then, Bayer has now absorbed Monsanto, which is a name that is so well known to people who work in the movements for good food. So really showing how large our solidarity needs to be as these folks or these corporations are really building so much power across every aspect of our lives and our health. So that brings me to my second question for everybody. And if you can just talk about, what would truly fair trade mean for you? I think in the order we were going to go, Fabio, you would be on next. Can you just talk for very short, like 4 minutes, about what truly fair trade would mean for you?
Bom, esse comércio justo, para nós do Movimento Sem Terra, ele precisa considerar alguns aspectos. O primeiro é que ele respeite a soberania dos povos, né? Então, não é todo mundo que precisa comer soja, não é todo mundo que precisa comer milho. Cada povo tem a sua forma de se alimentar, então não é ninguém de fora que precisa definir o que eu tenho que comer. Então, essa é uma coisa. A segunda é que esse comércio precisa valorizar a penosidade do trabalho rural, que não é um trabalho simples, não é um trabalho fácil, é um trabalho que demanda um esforço físico que precisa estar contabilizado no preço. Uma outra coisa, precisa respeitar a unidade familiar, ou seja, precisa dar visibilidade ao trabalho das mulheres. As mulheres trabalham muito no campo, não é à toa que, segundo a história, foram as mulheres que descobriram a agricultura, testando e observando as sementes. Então, ele precisa estar conectado com isso. A segunda, mais um ponto, ele precisa dialogar com essa ameaça que o mundo tem imposto para os seres humanos, que está materializado aí com as mudanças globais, né? Então, um comércio justo, ele precisa respeitar que o que seja comercializado, de fato, seja um alimento que tenha um compromisso com a questão social e, sobretudo, com a questão ambiental, né? Que não estimule o envenenamento dos solos, das águas e o aquecimento do clima. Então, essas são algumas coisas que eu gostaria de considerar nesse ponto, né? A gente tem pensado em pequenas feiras, numa relação mais próxima entre o produtor e o consumidor, e a tecnologia tem nos ajudado nesse sentido, né? Os aplicativos, as redes sociais, é algo que a gente tem aprendido a mexer e tem nos ajudado, apesar que a internet na zona rural brasileira não é nada fácil, mas, enfim, é um trabalho que a pandemia nos impôs a lidar. E de forma sintética e reduzindo, também querendo ouvir os outros colegas que estão aqui, eu chamaria atenção para esses aspectos, sabe? Essa relação sociais, né? Que valorize a cultura dos povos e a soberania alimentar, o que eles comem, respeitando a sua cultura, que valorize o trabalho das mulheres, e que seja sustentado em outras relações sociais e em outras relações com a natureza, na perspectiva da gente frear essa ameaça aí que está colocada pelo aquecimento global e consiga, de fato, dar o devido valor a essa coisa maravilhosa que é a produção de alimentos. Eu queria dar um dado aqui, que apesar da gente ser um dos maiores produtores de commodities agrícolas do mundo, é justamente a produção familiar, a produção dos pequenos agricultores que alimenta o povo brasileiro. 70% do que chega de comida na mesa do povo brasileiro vem dos pequenos agricultores. Os grandes agricultores produzem soja, milho, carne, eucalipto e soja para vender. E, como consequência, expulsa o povo do campo, queima e desmata as nossas florestas e polui os nossos solos, os nossos rios e a nossa mesa.
Thank you, Fabio. And I think it's so, it's so interesting, like that statistic that you just said is true pretty much around the globe, that 70% of the world's food comes from small scale farmers using like 25-ish% of the land. That the big agriculture is not very efficient at truly feeding people. Sonia, do you want to answer that question? What would truly fair trade look like to you and your organization?
Yeah, and I think maybe just again to layer on, because I think a lot of the comments that we've already heard, that what Fabio shared is sort of talking about food sovereignty or democratic control of food and agriculture systems, but just more broadly of the way that the choices that we have, we see that theme really flows into how one central tenet of what fair trade must look like is that workers need to also be able to have the power to shape their working conditions and their lives, our lives in our communities. And for us, that flows out of that concept of food sovereignty and sort of into this idea that workers, the best way to be able to do that is to have the right, be able to organize and bargain collectively for better wages and conditions. And that takes many different shapes, whether it's through a union, whether it's other forms of organizing, where workers are the ones democratically determining these are the conditions that we need. This is the kind of, these are the tools we want to use, and that those tools are worker-driven tools. And I think that Anna, you alluded to some of the Food Chain Workers Alliance members who have had to say, this is not fair trade when we look at Chobani, when we look at Fifes, the Mellon Company, that have been granted this Fair Trade USA label or be part of these pilot projects. And workers on the ground are saying, we don't think that this should be called fair trade because it doesn't, the companies are not respecting our right to organize or are not committing to respect a worker-driven tool, whether it's worker-driven social responsibility programs like Milk with Dignity, or the right to organize unions for dairy workers in New York State, as you were mentioning as well. So I think that for us, we see that element of workers' ability to democratically control their working conditions and to be able to organize is very central, because then even if there are, agreements that have provisions or standards that are that are decent without the ability for workers to be able to monitor and enforce that those standards are being met, then they become meaningless. So that's just one layer I wanted to allude to, but I think again it connects to all the other layers that others are sharing.
Yeah, definitely. The thread of democratic organizations, I think, goes throughout fair trade, whether it's, democratically organized small-scale farmer organizations or, worker control of their workplaces in whatever way they see fit. Manpreet, do you want to answer the question, what would truly fair trade look like to you?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions. I think that to answer this question, we have to recognize that colonialism has left a profound impact on global economies and food systems. And for us to be more justice-minded, we need to take a hard look at the systems and the way that we as individuals and organizations are complicit within those systems. I feel that fair trade at its worst is a manifestation of colonialism covered in a cloak of social good. And to advocate, and for me, I want to see the future of fair trade be more than the labels or certifications that we are putting on products and commodities. Fair trade cannot be considered the only solution. It is one part of a larger system. Done well, it's really challenging and recognizing that economic justice alone cannot solve very complex social or environmental issues. And we have to have a more intersectional approach. I feel that my vision for fair trade is ever evolving. But to be honest, I think that fair trade and my vision for fair trade as it stands right now is about seeing and challenging the way we connect as individuals and the way that we solve global issues and address inequities within communities. And I think those solutions have to be community driven, right? Like we can't have these conversations around building fair and equitable systems without recognizing that the system that we are in by its nature is exploitative and extractive. So to think about fair trade, I think we need to think about what does it look like to dismantle the systems we're in and rebuild with a place of recognizing that all of these issues are interconnected, right? We have to go beyond those cookie cutter approaches to trade. And that's something that I think we really have to work more actively towards, because right now I think a lot of the ways that we approach fair trade is very much with a cookie cutter approach. We assume that the same solutions will work regardless of the cultural, linguistic, and communal diversities that exist even within countries themselves. And so I think that fair wages cannot be the end goal, and using fair trade to address histories of extraction, colonialism, and exploitation is truly the starting point. I know, I think we lost.
Hey everyone.
Perfeito, Mark.
Yeah, I'm Katie. I'm kind of the Fair World Project staff member behind the logistics of this. Anna just texted me that her computer crashed and restarted. So we're going to keep moving forward and hope that she can rejoin us soon. Oh, she says that she's rejoining. So she should be rejoining us soon, and we'll transition to continuing this conversation. Really appreciate your patience as we work through this little glitch. And she's back.
Hi, sorry about that. My computer crashed and restarted, but I trust that y'all have continued the conversation without me. Will, did you get a chance to answer the question about what truly fair trade would look like for you, or do you want to take it away?
Happy to take it away. So yeah, what everyone else said, I definitely agree with. You know, I think that fair trade, truly fair trade, should be people driven. It should uplift working people throughout the world. It needs to put working people, human rights, health, and the environment above all else. It should not be a tool of billionaires to generate more revenue or corporations to generate more revenue. And it needs to be transparently done. When trade agreements are constructed, all too often, we don't have transparency, and you don't know what's going to be in them until it's too late. So they need to be transparently done, and they need to include stakeholders. They need to include working people. They need to include all the folks who are from communities impacted, and not just corporate lobbyists, which is something that we see all too often. And to the point raised before, these trade agreements really need to address inequities that have been in place for centuries. It's critical that if we need to have that idea that it's all about, these trade agreements should be about uplifting people and uplifting standards around the world.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would like to invite everybody now to add any questions you have into the Q&A. Unfortunately, when my computer crashed and I rejoined, the Q&A function reset. So if you had a question, I apologize if I missed it. But it looks like, actually, Kelly had a question. I can still see it. That's magical. Kelly asked, what should the world look like by 2030 to make fair trade move from a niche to the status quo? And I think some of you were starting to answer that question. Would love to hear any more if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I'll jump in. I think that I think we need to go beyond labels and certifications. And part of that is, we're essentially, I mean, Anna, you and I have had this conversation recently, actually, is when fair trade is almost thought of as something special, and really fair trade should be the status, should be the norm. Right. And the way that we do that is we start evaluating those systems. And I think, Will, you mentioned this so beautifully, is that it has to be about centering the people. It has to be about centering the climate. It has to be about creating community-led solutions, right? We often have a very top-down approach to trade. And that is how power manifests and continues to manifest within our systems. So, and I know that this is a very abstract answer, but I think that the reason it's abstract is it is very different depending on the spaces that you are in, right? I think that it is about each of us looking at what are the spaces that we have the ability to challenge the status quo, and how can we rethink power? How can we challenge those top-down approaches and really come up with community-driven solutions? Because that, if we think about food systems historically have been community-driven. They're about farmers and farm workers supporting their local communities, and community members also supporting the farmers and farm workers of their communities. So that has to be incorporated into how we think about fair trade and how do we make it the norm, because we can't make it the norm unless we really get off of our pedestals and think of how we can challenge power within the systems we're in.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to that? We had another question. Sarah was asking, I'd love to hear how the panelists anticipate the ways that climate change will increase challenges for workers in achieving fair trade, and how the movement can confront those challenges proactively. I don't know, Sonia, to pick on you, I know that you are organizing with a lot of workers who are thinking about those questions in real time.
Yeah, and I think this is really an emerging area that as the Alliance, we're sort of just trying to, think of the ways that workers and worker organizations' knowledge can be brought into some of these broader movements. But I think a lot of the themes that we've already described of how the kinds of conditions that force workers to migrate through trade policies are accelerated through climate change, and also looking at the ways that workers already are experiencing in many communities the environmental impacts of unsustainable industries, of whether that's pesticide exposure, whether it's the way that warehouse industries are requiring more and more land, and the way that pollution from airports, that I'm just thinking of our member in Southern California that has been leading a fight around not stopping the expansion of warehouse industries in the Inland Empire because of the environmental impact for communities, to thinking about just the impact of heat stress in workplaces that are not only outdoor workplaces, but also warehouses and restaurants. So a lot of our members are seeing firsthand already what the impacts are of that increased migration, increased environmental degradation and impact, in especially using environmental justice lens of who are the communities that are most affected. There are communities of color, it's low income communities, and then looking at what just the rising heat that we all are experiencing, how it is literally life and death in farm worker communities and other communities. One of our members, Farm Workers Association of Florida, has been doing really important long range research to look at what does it mean for a farm worker who is working in elevated heat conditions in prolonged time periods. What does it actually physiologically mean for your body, and just the kinds of ways that your body just cannot cope with that kind of heat, and being able to prove the long-term impacts, which is so critical to be able to lift up. So absolutely all of those challenges are, we see that they are only going to be exacerbated until and when we can address this climate emergency. But I think that the analysis that we really appreciate hearing from those same member organizations and other sort of broader movements, and those, including those here in this panel, is that we can't see these things as separate. That climate justice is worker justice, is economic justice, is racial justice, is migrant justice. That it's not that there's a solution that comes separate from looking at the ways that we address all of the things we've been talking about in this panel, and that from a specific lens of workers' rights, that workers are the ones who have to be able to negotiate the kinds of conditions that will challenge corporate practices. And certainly policy is important, and we want to fight as hard as we can for the things like a OSHA heat stress standard that is currently being developed, that it must be it must work. It must be something that actually will protect workers. So absolutely there's a lens of policy, but like everything that we're describing, the power has to come from the bottom up to be able to truly reverse this crisis. And so the ways that we do that together in community, and the solidarity that it's going to take is, we appreciate these chances to start to vision and brainstorm what that looks like. But the seeds are there. We know what it is that we need to fuel more of, and that's organizing by directly affected communities.
Yeah, for sure. And, just to tag on to that, I think you were talking earlier about the importance of democratic organization and building that power. And, we just saw in my state of Oregon, actually this week, that there is now an OSHA heat standard, OSHA being organizational or occupational safety health. They're the ones that make workplace safety rules, and they set a heat standard finally. And that was because of the organizing of farm worker organizations, and actually environmental justice organizations really came through and supported that too. Does anybody else want to speak to kind of the bigger question of, organizing for trade justice within a world where the climate crisis is really bearing down on all of us?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is really critical is that we remove barriers in trade agreements that prevent us from tackling climate change, and that force us to have one hand tied behind our back when it comes to climate change. So like the investor state dispute settlement system, for example, I think is very detrimental to have if we're going to have countries take any action, because if you have the threat of being sued and losing a ton of money over anything you do to combat climate change, whenever a corporation doesn't agree with it, you can't really be expected to pass laws or legislation that will actually, make a difference. I think that one of the things that working people face in California was, we've had a lot of wildfires here, and I know a lot of you in the Pacific Northwest have had wildfires. But in California, I think there's an image that none of us can get out of our minds, and that's of farm workers working in the fields with hazardous level smoke in the air with no protective equipment whatsoever, and just working in the fields in Salinas or in Kern County or wherever they were working. And it's just, I grew up in Salinas, California, and it's something that you never forget how badly treated working people farm workers are in that community by the folks in Big Ag. So, it's really important that we fight hard and quickly to make sure that barriers are removed, and then also protections are put into place for those folks.
Thank you. Fabio, it looks like you want to get in on this topic.
Sim, eu gostaria de dialogar com a fala das duas companheiras, né, a Sônia e me desculpa a companheira aí que falou sobre a Índia, se eu não falar o nome dela corretamente, a Manpreet, e o Jamil, que para além dessa necessidade da gente conseguir garantir, né, uma soberania popular que valorize as comunidades, né, nos seus locais, a gente precisa construir formas de diálogo, né, como essa, por exemplo, que nos permita trocar experiência, que nos permita trocar saberes, mas, sobretudo, que nos permita pensar em soluções e fazer essas soluções de forma articulada, né? Considerando que essas corporações fazem toda a sua movimentação de forma articulada, né? Impactando da mesma forma, mas com diferentes proporções em todo o país, em todos os países. Então, essa resistência ela precisa também ser articulada. Então, eu queria valorizar esse espaço, chamar atenção para a importância dele, falar do quanto tem sido interessante ouvir o companheiro, ouvir as companheiras, mas colocar esse elemento no debate, né? É importante que se faça a luta na Califórnia, é importante que se faça a luta na Índia, é importante que se faça a luta no Brasil, óbvio que sim, mas é importante que a gente tenha formas de também articular a nossa luta a nível mundial. E mais espaços como esse precisam ser organizados. Então, era só esse complemento que eu queria fazer, concordando com os colegas que já falaram. E eu peço desculpa, minha internet está muito ruim, então às vezes eu desligo a câmera, tá bom?
Understood, and appreciate you being here, and I appreciate everybody who shows up in all the ways that make sense for them, and being on video on Zoom all the time is exhausting. A little realness for you there. As we kind of wrap this around, I think that there are so many amazing questions in the chat that we could go for a whole day, but I think one of the themes that's coming up is one of the questions that I would have in closing as we start to wind this down, and that is, how are you? I would love to hear for ways for folks to plug in. So, any way that you would like to have people listening today take one action coming out of this. If there's something you would like to share about your work, and feel free to talk about it. Also share a link in the chat. Fabio, do you want to? Okay.
Do you mind if I just add to the climate change question for just a moment?
Certainly.
I'm so sorry.
No. Time to talk more about this giant.
Yeah, I just, I thought that question was really interesting, partially because I just want to reflect on the context that I'm coming to this conversation in is, around the farmers' protest, but so much of my work within the fair trade system is working with companies and organizations that are producing fair trade goods in India and other parts of the world. And, one of the things I want to acknowledge is, if you Google right now, climate change India, you'll notice that there is an extreme heat wave going across India and Pakistan, which is resulting in people really, people are dying and this is all a result of climate change. So I think that economic justice and climate justice are two separate entities is really naive, because a lot of the organizations that are working towards fair systems and producing fair goods are working in countries where the communities are most impacted by climate change. And we cannot think that just fair wages is the end goal. We have to recognize the way in which our production cycles are also putting those communities at high risk. And we have to recognize our waste streams. Those are such an important part of these conversations when we talk about how does climate change impact individuals. Climate change impacts individuals because many of the people who are working within our supply chains are the people most impacted by climate change. And so we cannot keep those conversations separate.
Thank you for keeping that in the conversation. Yeah, so we just unfortunately have a few minutes left. In closing, if you want a quick lightning round so everybody gets in. Fabio, how would you like folks listening today to join your work or support your work?
Olha, é a gente assumir esse compromisso de estar junto nessa luta, né? E em nome do Movimento Sem Terra e do povo brasileiro, eu reafirmo esse compromisso da gente estar junto nessa luta internacional por melhorias de condições de vida, por melhores alimentos, para a gente conseguir dar essa girada nessa ameaça que a questão climática tem nos imposto, e, sobretudo, superar essa ganância do capitalismo, né? Construir um outro mundo com outros valores, com novos homens e novas mulheres. Então, o que eu posso fazer é assumir que no Brasil, a cada assentamento que a gente conquista, a gente considera que a luta ela não se define aqui, ela se define a nível global. Então, ela tem também uma representatividade dos camponeses de todo canto do mundo, né? Não é à toa que a gente está com grupos de pessoas espalhadas por vários lugares. Queria dizer que nessa pandemia, a população, o povo sem terra, foi responsável pela doação de mais de 6.000 toneladas de alimentos para as pessoas da zona urbana, da periferia, que passou dificuldades, que perdeu o emprego. Mais de 1 milhão de pratos de comida foram doados. Isso produto produzido nos nossos assentamentos de reforma agrária. Dizer que a gente tem um plano nacional para, em 10 anos, plantar 100 milhões de árvores. Já plantamos 2 milhões e a gente quer chegar a 100 milhões de árvores nos próximos 8 anos, na verdade, né, que já estamos com 2 anos de plano. Faremos agora, na próxima semana, um curso de capacitação, onde vamos reunir mais de 100 pessoas que estão envolvidas com produção de mudas, e a gente quer trabalhar com mudas nativas, com mudas com frutíferas, com mudas que tenham potencial medicinal, enfim. E a gente espera que o nosso grito de resistência e de luta aqui no Brasil ele também seja ecoado aí na Califórnia, aí na Índia. Nós temos comitê de amigos espalhados por vários países, inclusive talvez tenha gente dos Estados Unidos acompanhando o nosso debate. Se tiver, talvez o Saulo, já aproveito para mandar um forte abraço para ele. Enfim, falar da satisfação que foi estar compartilhando esse momento com vocês e reafirmar o nosso compromisso de estar fazendo a nossa luta aqui no Brasil, não só em nome dos camponeses brasileiros, mas em nome da população mundial.
Thank you so much, Fabio. Sonia, how do you want folks to support your work?
Yes, I put the link for the website of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Our mission is to be connecting up workers' struggles across the food chain, and there are many really critical fights that our member organizations are involved in. So just for simplicity's sake, sharing our website, there's a place to sign up for email updates or just to follow on social media. We really, every week there's a different struggle that we are through our social media uplifting, and just encourage people to support these really critical fights, and look forward to staying in connection and staying in community with all of you.
Thank you. Manpreet, what would you have people do?
Yeah, for me, I think that it's really important we recognize that I would say the theme in today's conversation was change is community driven. So look within your own communities and see the ways in which you can create impact and help challenge the status quo. And so for me, my parting 2 cents is really to create space for learning and for listening. I think we don't listen enough. And for us to create change, we have to come together and we have to look within our own communities. Sometimes it's easy to get really engrossed in some of the more global conversations, which I think are important, but recognizing that even the change that we're creating in our communities feed into those global conversations as well. And if you want to stay in touch, I have a podcast. Anna and I did record an episode on certifications. I know there was a question on certifications. So that will be hopefully releasing soon. So you're welcome to follow the podcast for continuous learning.
Fantastic. Thank you. Will, we are right at the
Yeah.
What do you have?
I'll lightning round this. So yeah, the Trips Waiver campaign is one way for folks to connect with us. If you follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, it's at CA Trade Justice. You know, I will say there's been more conversations than ever before about fair trade. You know, recently I got invited by the USITC to speak about how Black and brown workers were impacted negatively by trade deals, and that's something that I did not expect to happen. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of meetings that are happening in your own communities with members of Congress to talk about TRIPS and digital trade. And, you know, it's important to educate folks about the importance of fair trade. So please feel free to also check out the Trade Justice Ed Fund as well for more resources on that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think Will's group has really shown some of the power of taking these global issues and bringing it like right in front of embassies and your local reps to really put pressure on. So great ways to get involved locally. Thank you so much to everybody who has joined us today. Special thanks to our panelists. I really appreciate all of your perspective. I could probably hang out here and talk with you longer, but we all have busy days. And thank you again to our interpreters who have made this conversation possible. And to my coworker, Katie, who held it together when my computer decided to crash. Please join us on social media to continue this conversation. We will be following up with the recording and other ways to stay involved via email. But I really appreciate all of you joining us today. Thank you so much. And hopefully you can take some of this energy into World Fair Trade Day on Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.